Hello, and welcome to the Mitch Grows Show, the solution-focused chat show where we can learn and grow together. In today's episode, I went to visit David and Amanda Wolfe from Wakelyns. Wakelyns is one of the most longest established and diverse agroforestry sites in the world. Wakelyns is an oasis of life surrounded by huge fields growing monoculture crops dependent on agricultural chemicals. The Suffolk-based farm is the birthplace of Wakyu wheat, a genetically diverse wheat population created by breeding 20 varieties of wheat together to make a wheat that's more resistant to pest and disease, amongst so many other benefits. This was my first ever interview for the Mitch Grows Show, and I was feeling nervous throughout the chat. I struggled to get my words out at times, so with that word of warning, and without further ado, let's jump into this chat and find out more about agroforestry and what Wakelyns do. Thank you very much, guys, for taking the time to speak to me today. I'm so excited to be here and look around. Would you just be able to start off and let me know who you are and a brief introduction to Wakelyns and how it started?
Yep, so I'm David Wolfe. My parents bought Wakelyns in 1992 and they set up the agroforestry system that you see here. My mum died in 2016 and my dad in 2019. So the next generation, as we put it, Amanda and me and my brother who lives in Ireland have taken over, and now we're running Wakelyns.
How is it set up with the different zones that you've got here?
So they started planting agroforestry from 1994, and because my dad was a scientist and constantly wanted to experiment, and because there were no examples of agroforestry to copy, they effectively planted 6 different areas of agroforestry. And so they are characterised by different spacings of alleys and different combinations of trees, and different ways of doing it. So in a sense, Wakelyns is actually 5 or 6 different areas of agroforestry, which is partly what makes it so fun, but partly also what makes it such a challenge.
So would you be able to tell us a little bit about what agroforestry is, some of its benefits, and how does it compare to conventional farming?
Okay, that's a lot. Okay, so the agroforestry that we have here at Wakelyns is characterised by lines of trees running north-south. Now, north-south, so you get the maximum sun in the alleys between the trees. Our alleys are variously 12 metres, 15 metres or 18 metres apart. So if you look at it from the air, you see a sort of striped pattern. People who are planting agroforestry now, more recently, are planting with wider alleys, but we're the 12, 15, 18 metre alleys. And then within those alleys is an organic rotation. So in the Wakelyns system, we're on a roughly 4-year cycle. So we have a couple of years of a ley crop, a fertility building ley, clover grass mix, and then 2 years of crops, which might be wheat or lentils or whatever. So that is rotating around the farm. And then in the tree lines, depending on which bit of the farm you're in, it's either a biomass crop or a fruit crop or a timber crop. Or whatever. So you see different, if you look at, as you wander around, Mitch, you'll see different areas of different styles of agroforestry and different produce combinations. In terms of the benefits that brings, well, you've got a very diverse system. You've not got everything in one wheat crop or one bean crop or one potato crop. You've got a huge variety of things, which gives its own resilience to weather and pests and disease and soil and all the rest of it. But you've also got then a fantastic abundance of different sorts of things which operate sympathetically with each other to support each other in the field, whether that's through reducing disease, retaining moisture, whatever it may be. So that's the complex and exciting diversity of agroforestry.
Amazing. And how does it compare to conventional farming?
Well, you're really trying to do a completely different thing, because a conventional farmer, certainly in East Anglia, is probably just growing possibly one field or a small number of fields of big commodity crops. So it might be lots of wheat, or it might be lots of field beans, or lots of potatoes or sugar beet. We are trying to farm much more sympathetically with nature and the community and the food supply. And so we want this farm to be sustainable operationally, environmentally, financially going forwards in a way that modern farming, the kind of modern farming that's been going on in this country for the last 80 or so years, just isn't sustainable in those terms.
Amazing. And you touched on community then. Would you be able to tell me a little bit about your role here and other members of staff?
What we've developed over the last couple of years are 2 sort of systems. One is, we call it short food chains, and the other is enterprise stacking. So instead of growing and selling wheat or flour, or picking cherries and selling cherries. We want that all to happen on the site. So that what's produced is bread, cherry pies, craft products, a whole range of things like that are coming from the land and directly being used, processed, whatever, to do products, food products or other products that are then either eaten or used either absolutely on site or in the local community. So that's the short food chains. In order to make that work, we need the people who are doing that to be living here or based here. And so we now have a growing, call it a community if you like, of people who are living on site or living nearby, who are working either with us or in their own enterprises on the Wakelyns site, to make that all sustainable. And the other thing that then allows us to do, it allows us to invite and bring people in here for courses and events. So people will come here for a sourdough course or a craft course or a beekeeping course, or for one of our open days. So that allows us to invite people here to come and stay here, to visit here, to learn, to enjoy, to eat the food, to see it all happening, to connect with where their food is grown. So for us, the people, whether they're people who live and work here or people who visit and learn here, that's all as much part of the system as the actual growing.
And you asked about the community. There is a real community of people who are we're developing relationships with, and they help each other out. They are very much essential to their own businesses, their own individual businesses, in terms of how it works and and the sort of end result. So, for example, Henrietta and Maisie are the Wakelyns bakery, and they run their bakery. That's their enterprise. We provide the infrastructure, but it's their business. They are also the people that then pick the fruit from the trees, and they pick the produce from the trees, but they're helped by the three women that are the community supported agriculture, the Real Veg team, because they support each other and they help each other out. So that's one good example of we're all part of the same community, but they help each other and support each other. And that's what we're really valuing, those growing relationships. It's lovely.
Faye here that I met briefly earlier, and her workshop.
So Faye calls herself the woodland haberdasher. I think she invented that description. Haberdasher because traditionally haberdashery is about sort of small crafty products that are associated with clothes. So she makes a lot of buttons and toggles and that kind of thing. But I think she's diversified a long way from that more recently. So she is another short food chain, another stacked enterprise at Wakelyns. She is taking, not food chain, a short craft chain, if you like. She's taking produce from the fields, whether that's bark or trees or stuff from the hedgerows, or some stuff she grows like woad, to do wood carving, natural dyeing, natural fibres. Again, completely integrated with the land and the agriculture and the biodiversity. Again, another person working and living here, another product from the same relatively small area, another person who's running courses and events here. So each of the different communities, activities, enterprises, call them what you like, they are all working closely with the land and supporting it, but also using it. And Faye brings an unusual dimension to that. She's, it's not unusual to have growers working together, but to have growers and a craft person all doing stuff on site is absolutely fantastic. We've also got a couple here who are not yet based here, called Adam and Emma, who you might actually meet if you hang around this afternoon. And they are doing a lot of the willow weaving stuff. So they use our willow for structural willow, but also basket willow and courses and so on. One of the things they want to be able to do is to run courses doing basket weaving at Wakelyns, where you actually pick your willow in the morning and you weave it there and then that day, which apparently is very unusual or possibly unique. So the idea that you can do all these things at the point where the materials are being produced. So you literally, the willow you're making into a basket was growing and you cut it this morning. It's not a sort of commodity crop that's just been brought in as a craft product. So that's very much our style, is to integrate food and growing and activities and people with the land and the stuff that's around us.
One thing to mention there is that obviously the agroforestry and the science around agroforestry, and then particularly with the wheat that was Martin developed with the Organic Research Centre. That was very much Martin's project, and I think we feel that the other element of the things that we're developing here in relation to the arts and crafts and the numbers, the tree line numbers that you've seen and the birds that you've seen in the scrap metal there, that's very much us bringing through Anne's influence, David's mum, because she was very much interested in the vegetable growing, the horticulture, but also the arts and the crafts and so on. So we feel like we're sort of delivering up on their original project, but then taking it to the next generation.
So much I want to ask you right now. So we're just going to go back and talk a little bit about your mum and dad, if that's all right, and what their vision was when they set up Wakelyns, and as you said, bringing their touches in with the artwork that we've seen around here.
When they bought Wakelyns in 1992, I mean, it was very much as a retirement thing because it was associated with my mum stopping being a teacher and my dad stopping being a government scientist. And I think they like any project, it evolved over time. So they didn't set out to do what they ended up doing. They set out to do some innovative agroforestry. Nobody had done that before, and see what happened. That massively took off, and it got more complicated when the Organic Research Centre team were based here for a few years, and that really increased the sort of scientific research component of it. So over the years, Wakelyns was on the one hand an agroforestry farm, then it became a research establishment, then, as Amanda mentioned, my mum got involved in growing horticultural stuff and vegetables, and there was a bit of market gardening, and they did some farmers markets and so on. So really, a lot of the stuff that we're doing now was beginning to happen over the years before. We've evolved that. We brought more people in. We've definitely brought people in here for events and courses and holiday makers and so on. So really, it's a continuum. But I think if you'd come here in 1992, what you started out with is very different to what there is now. Both in terms of what my parents did, but also what we're doing.
Amazing. And if we go back to the land a little and we talk about YQ wheat, what is YQ wheat and how does it compare to conventional wheat crops of monocultures?
Yeah, so if you go out and look at a field of wheat in this country or pretty much anywhere else in developing countries, certainly, what you see in that field is a field of wheat or indeed barley or oats or whatever it is, where every plant in the field is genetically identical to every other plant in the field. So from the point of view of the chemical companies and the seed companies, that's very satisfactory. From the point of view of the sort of European global markets, it's very satisfactory because it's a very homogeneous thing. So it's very simple. You know that this wheat is Skyfall, it looks and behaves like Skyfall, but the difficulty is that it's then potentially very vulnerable to the environmental factors. So whether that's the weather or pathogens, diseases, the soil, whatever it might be. And now we have an idea of how pandemics, everybody knows how a pandemic works. In a way, it's quite easy to see the problem with that, because if you imagine if every single person in the country was genetically identical to every other person in the country, and they were susceptible to COVID, woof, the whole population would be wiped out. Now, they might find an answer, they might find a vaccine, but they'd have to hit the spot with the vaccine, and then they'd have to have another vaccine and another vaccine. Now, part of the reason that as a population of people we're resilient to that is because we're genetically diverse. Each person is genetically different to each other person. That gives us a resilience to survive the environment in which we exist. So the problem with most modern agriculture and most wheats, for example, is they don't have that resilience. They are completely dependent upon getting it just right in terms of the weather and the soil and the chemical additives and so on. Now, all of that, my dad and the Organic Research Centre wanted to put behind us. They wanted, if you like, to have a much more natural approach to the way a wheat population would work or a wheat plant would work. So what they did was they took, to generate that in a sense slightly artificially, is they took 20 different sorts of wheat and they crossed them, they bred them between each other. And that produced something like 190 genetically different children, if you like. And they then planted those genetically different children in the field. And each year, now for about 15 years, that's then been harvested and replanted. So we have at Wakelyns wheat that has been growing here in its population now successive years, and so that will have literally evolved as a genetically diverse population to suit the soil, the environment, the weather, and so on of Wakelyns. Sometimes people have come and taken away sections of that. So I know you, Mitch, you know Maple Farm. They've taken, if you like, they took a bag of YQ a few years ago. They now grow YQ. So it's not the same as our YQ now because it will have evolved its own way. It's a bit like migration. You know, the Irish population in New York or Chicago are genetically different too, but they're obviously based upon the Irish population of Ireland. So it's a bit like that, I like to think. So what you then have is a genetically diverse population of, in this case, wheat. And the YQ was that they did various different combinations, and YQ was one of them, and it's the one that's most successful. It's the one that's been most used elsewhere. So that then gives you, if you like, a type of wheat that is then more resilient to the environmental factors. The bakers absolutely love it. You can now get, as I say, YQ from different farms. So the YQ from Wakelyns is not the same as the YQ from Maple Farm or the YQ from John Turner's farm in Nottinghamshire, but they all came from Wakelyns originally. You've now also then got people developing in America and elsewhere new populations. So YQ was the first population of that kind. In the future, there will no doubt be more successful populations because people will do it better than Martin and the ORC originally did it at Wakelyns. But the basic idea of those populations is now gaining a currency and an understanding, particularly but not exclusively in an organic context. So that's the YQ population wheat which we have at Wakelyns, and so all the bread here is made from the Wakelyns' own flour, and that again is contributing to the short food chain. So we feel pleased with that.
So staying on the theme of how diverse Wakelyns is, and you've just got an incredible amount of apples. Would you be able to tell me a bit about the apples? Do you have any favourites?
So Wakelyns has about, we're not quite sure, we think 38 varieties of apples, and then plums and cherries and quinces and so on, a whole variety of things. The great joy of that is we have this huge variation of apples and so on. But it's also a challenge in terms of the farming. So what we've done with that variety is the short food chains as the solution. So Henrietta and Maisie in the bakery are part-time fruit pickers, part-time baker chefs. So they are literally looking out to see which tree is ripening at what point, harvesting it at exactly the right moment, and then doing delicious things with it. So they are then doing dried apples and apple cakes and apple chutneys and so on. Apple juice we have a whole combination of different apple juices in different blends. So really sort of celebrating the variety of all of that. We have a very long apple season, as you can imagine. And an example, I mean, even in the short time that Amanda and I have been involved the last couple of years, you see how in one year some varieties do well, in another year other varieties do well. So again, that's giving you a resilience to the variation of climate and weather and so on. In a way that you wouldn't get if you were just doing a commercial monocrop of apples. So they all have their own different characteristics, and Henrietta and Maisie are fantastic at making great things from them. So the other thing they do great things with is squash. They've made a big feature of using a variety of what we do. We've grown, well, last year it was 8 varieties, the previous year 16 varieties of squash, and then they've diversified into all sorts of different things you can do with squash, including the kind of conventional things people do with squash, cook them and put butter in them. That's easy and delicious. But also squash in mince pies, squash, candied squash tarts. Squash they made, so who'd have believed it. That they would say if they were here, they have this lovely farm product, and rather than starting with the recipe and then saying I need to buy the ingredients, they start with what's out there in the field and work out delicious ways of using it to make delicious food and drink products. So,
going back to the sort of artistic or the more creative side of things as well, you'll see on the wall behind you there's some pictures of apples, and so they are photographs that were taken by somebody called Richard Allenby Pratt. He's a photographer known as the Suffolk Project, and he took some wonderful pictures of all of the varieties of apples and then created them into these sort of mixed pictures there. And then when we had Apple Day in October, we then had an exhibition of his apple photos, and they were available for sale. And so again, it's the various strands that are coming off of the core underlying organic farming here that also include community, but the community also means people that are doing these other things, including, the art and the, the more sort of creative side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful when you walk around the alleys, rows of trees, and they're all numbered. And there was one that we spoke about earlier, which is quite famous for the jam.
That's tree line 16. Henrietta likes tree line 16 because it's about June, July, isn't it? July, maybe? Mm-hmm. July. There are some wonderful plums in tree line 16, varieties of plums, and she particularly likes them. And she makes tree line 16. Yeah, combination. Tree line 16 jam. Watch out for it.
We spoke about a lot of things earlier, and one of the ones that we was talking about was some of the rarer species that you have in the pond, some crested newts. Mm-hmm. I just wondered how diverse is Wakelyns, and what have you got here?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of involvement with various wildlife organisations like the Suffolk Wildlife Trust and the RSPB, who've done a lot of survey work, and they've helped us both in terms of telling us how to improve our practices, but also in sort of management, literally projects on the ground, to improve the biodiversity and to support the biodiversity which is here. A bit of that has included Suffolk Wildlife Trust did a big pond renovation project last year, beginning of 2021, where there was an old pond that was very silted up, where the water had included runoff from our neighbour's field, where there's a lot of nitrogen fertiliser being used. So that pond was never going to be a clean, environmentally friendly pond. It was always full of algae because of the excess nutrients coming from his fertiliser. So that pond was frankly sort of sterile in terms of biodiversity. So their cleaning out of it and their diverting of the ditch it's now come back. It's liberated. It's come back as a beautifully clear water. We've now got the plants have returned to it. The pond plants have returned to it. There are definitely great crested newts in the fields here. They will, we hope, go and breed and lay their eggs in it. So we hope that that's an example of the kind of project we've been able to do. I mean, people ask me, have you got longitudinal studies of the biodiversity over time? And I say, well, we haven't got historic studies of what it was like when my parents took over in 1992. But if you look over the field, you only need to look over the hedge and look at the sort of biodiversity desert that surrounds us to get a sense of how things have changed. We have huge numbers of varieties of birds and badgers, foxes, deer, hares, all sorts of things here that are just not happening next door, and that's part of the strength and the beauty of it, as well as supporting the environmental basics that we need.
We also have turtle doves, so we're very excited when the turtle doves arrived. And last year we heard the turtle doves, and we were the first reported turtle dove in Suffolk. Yeah.
So turtle doves are very rare, and they're one of the species that's getting rarer. They're a very good example of a bird that's really suffered because of changing farming practices. So there aren't many places in the country where they exist now. Suffolk is one of the places where there are still some, and even in Suffolk there aren't very many. We have a few pairs that come here every year. They go to Africa in the winter, and then they come back every spring. Early May they arrive. We're part of a supplementary feeding project with the RSPB, but they seem to love our fields and our hedges and the sort of traditional agriculture that's going on here. And so they're always it's always a great sense of pleasure when the turtle doves arrive, and then they're here for the summer. They breed, they have babies, and off they go again. So that's a rare treat. And we have people who come here especially to hear the turtle dove. They've got a very distinctive purring sort of noise, and once you've heard it, you never forget it, and you always know when they're here. So that's it's a great feature.
Amazing. I've never heard one, never seen one. So
come back after about the second week of May, between the second week of May and about the second week of August, and they're great. They love it on a sunny day.
So I just wanted to touch on next door, if you wouldn't mind speaking about that, and how detrimental the spraying is to modern farming, and how that style of farming compares to what you're doing here.
Yeah, so it's not so much just next door. Most farming in East Anglia and indeed this country is in large open fields, growing single crops, very much intended for sort of commodity markets rather than local food. They tend to choose what they grow simply for what's going to make the most money this year rather than what's needed to feed local people. Most of that farming is characterised by heavy reliance on spraying, heavy reliance on farming right up to the ditches, removing hedges and that kind of thing, characterised by big open fields, so very windy, very at risk therefore of windborne pathogens, spores from potato blight or whatever it might be blowing across the fields. So that kind of very open farming, which has really been the feature of East Anglia in this country since after the Second World War, is now running its course. It's only sustainable through very extensive government subsidies, yet it doesn't even produce the food that we need in this country. It doesn't produce much employment. Those sort of farms, few big tractors, not many people employed. That style of agriculture really has run its course. I think people are increasingly realising, and so change is coming.
So that leads me on to two questions. The first is, how could we convince unwilling farmers to adopt more regenerative style of farming or agroforestry?
So I suspect there are plenty of farmers out there who are always interested in improving and changing, and I don't think people set out to do environmental harm. I think they're partly trapped by their existing systems, their existing machinery, their existing relationships with seed companies and so on. And they're also very much informed by the way the government subsidy schemes work, because most farming in this country makes very little money for the farmer. They make their money from subsidies and so on. But the subsidy schemes are not designed to encourage them to do innovative, regenerative, environmentally friendly techniques. So I think I think it's all possible to encourage and persuade people to shift the balance. They just need to be given the right incentives and encouragement and the right examples of how to do it. I think some of those farms have now become so big that they're a long way away from people. So I think getting people back on the land is a big component of that, communities and so on. But we'll see. I think it's all doable, and it needs to be done. Climate change is a very important driver for those things. We need more trees, we need smaller fields, we need more agroforestry. The Committee on Climate Change says we need a third of the farms to be doing significant amounts of agroforestry. That's going to take a big change. That's got to be incentivised.
But last year, when we had our East Anglian agroforestry weekend, what we found was we had quite a few large sort of 3-generational families, farming families, come where, the grandparents were the original farmers and then the parents were the current farmers. And then what was really interesting, wasn't it, was that the children who knew they were inheriting these big farms were coming to show their parents and grandparents and really ask lots of questions about how they might put agroforestry into their existing farms. So I think there's lots of interest in it. And in a sense, that's what we're helping to demonstrate. This was an experiment. And as you've seen, as you've walked around, there are lots of different versions of it. And lots of people have been here and learnt from the mistakes that were made in those early experiments and done it differently. But I think we're going to continue to show families with big farms how they can do it, or in a bit of it, or even if the community supported agriculture that you've seen as well. Big farms could give up a small pocket of space for communities of people to grow vegetables, for example. So we hope that some of the things that we're doing here on a very small scale, people can see and try in their much bigger farms.
One of the other things I think about the big farms is their use of hedgerows, and they're basically just used as boundaries and not seen as like a highway for the wildlife to move through. How can we stop this heavy cutting down of the hedgerows?
Well, it's not just seen as a boundary; they're actually seen as a problem. So historically, farmers have taken hedgerows out. The fields around us used to be lots of small fields, and now one big field because the hedgerows have been taken out even in the last few years. And very often, I think farmers know they're not supposed to do that. It's a criminal offence to remove a hedge in that way, but people do it anyway because they know that once it's gone, it's gone. So I think it's partly about those landowners realising that. We need hedgerows for biodiversity, we need hedgerows for climate change, for carbon sequestration. But again, we also need to incentivise, to encourage, to enforce the law to make it that they're encouraged to plant them rather than dig them up. And that's a really long-term problem because, you plant a hedge now, it's going to take 10 or 20 years to be, a thriving hedge. It's got to be done sooner rather than later.
So you're basically saying that Wakelyns is a research centre, and it has been for a very long time. Just wondered if there's any other approaches to farming that you guys are taking, and what research is currently being done.
Wakelyns was planted very much as experimental agroforestry. Then for a number of years, the Organic Research Centre people were based here doing a lot of science here. That to some extent paused when my dad died because he was really the scientist here. But we're now rekindling relationships with the Organic Research Centre and other universities and other researchers. We've had people we had a woman here doing some research for her MSc last year. We've got a woman who's going to start doing a PhD involving stuff here. We're making links with universities. So it won't be Amanda and me who do the research because we're not agriculture scientists in the way that my dad was. But we're absolutely keen for Wakelyns to be a sort of test bed, a place where people come and do stuff. And that's very much happening. So we're part with the ORC of a European project looking at mature agroforestry systems across Europe. We're one of 6 sites being measured across Europe to look at how the soil has changed, how the biodiversity has changed, how all the components that they're measuring, and they're doing a big comparative exercise. So we're very keen and happy to be part of those bigger processes, very much as an adjunct to what we're doing ourselves.
And on a different scale, perhaps the CSA in their horticultural alley are doing it on a no-dig way of growing veg, and again, that's not been done here before. And I think that's really fascinating to watch and see the produce that's coming out of, their alley. And I'd like to think that we might be able to develop that in the other sort of alleys. Sorry, I'm distracted by the cat who's just realised we're here.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, what we're doing at Wakelyns is generally a research project. I mean, whether that's about people or, I think historically my dad was very involved in that, if you like, hardcore agricultural research. What we're doing now is more social research, more food research, more. It's all experimental, and it's all part of a sort of demonstration trial that other people can come and have a look at and pick the good bits and improve them and do their own version of it. It's all experimental in that sense.
I'm just going back to you, Amanda, with the no dig. So I'm a no dig grower myself, and it just makes so much sense leaving the soil undisturbed. I just wondered, is there any research being done here about no dig on a bigger scale?
No, so the organic rotation here we have in the big fields, the sort of macro rotation, is still at the moment a relatively conventional approach. We plough and we drill in a conventional way. One thing I would like to evolve that, so we go to a more of a no-dig approach to the farming, if you like, a zero-till approach, I think more called on that scale. But we haven't got to that yet, so that's definitely a project for the future.
Amazing. And before we move on, could you just talk to me a little bit more about the rotations that you do in the alleys?
So we have 56 alleys within the rotation. It's more or less a 4-year cycle, and within that 4-year cycle, it works out more or less that we have 2 years of in any one alley of a fertility building lay. So that's a grass clover mix. So that would look like a field. If you look at it from a distance, it looks like a field, a sort of grassy field. And then in the other 2 years, we would typically grow a wheat or a lentil crop or something, a more conventional food crop. And that rotation then moves around the farm. So if you look at any one alley, over a 4-year cycle, it will be doing different things. Other people have a shorter rotation, so less than 4 years, and a greater part of that is in crops. But they almost invariably have either animals or they import manure as a fertiliser. So one of the things about Wakelyns is that it's never had external fertility imported, never had manure or anything like that, which I think is very unusual for an organic farm. That means we have to spend more of the whole lifetime, if you like, growing our own fertility in the cycle. So the trade-off is it's a self-contained system. So really, Wakelyns has been a self-contained organic rotation for the best part of 25 years, which is quite special, I think.
Very, very special. So before we wrap things up, there's just a few questions I'd like to ask to get a bit more of an insight. And there's two of you here, so I get two for the price of one. The first is a book recommendation and why.
Well, I would probably say Wilding by Isabella Trees, because I think that book has inspired people to think about rewilding and the countryside in a way that perhaps has become very accessible to people. So lots of people have come here and have asked us if we have any bits of Wakelyns that are being rewilded, perhaps because they've read her book. And I think, it's not the same as Wakelyns, but I think it has inspired people to think about the countryside and, sort of us being custodians of the countryside and climate change and so on.
So I'm looking at a book at the moment called Cabin Porn. It is relevant, because I think increasingly people will need to live in smaller places and more integrated into the countryside. And one of the ways that you can do that is you can make your housing unit more sort of imaginative. So this is people across the world who have made cabins to live in exciting rural places, and it's inspiring ideas of how you might do that more innovatively and more interestingly and more environmentally friendly in an environmentally friendly way.
Very, very good recommendations. Thank you. The second is a project or person you think worthwhile me going to speak to.
Obviously, Mike Mallet at Maple Farm. He is an example, that farm's an example of somebody who came to Wakelyns, saw the agroforestry and went away and did their version of it. Other examples of people doing similar things include a guy called George Young, who is Fobbing's Farm. He's Farming George on Instagram. He's on a much bigger scale, so he's a big farm. He's inherited, I'm not sure his parents are, I think his parents are still alive. He's working his parents' big farm in Essex, doing some very innovative stuff with crops, agroforestry, some organic stuff, some cattle. So he's taken some of the Wakelyns ideas. Another guy is Steve Briggs, near Peterborough, who's doing agroforestry. So if you want to see the ways in which the Wakelyns project has been evolved by other people, they're worth looking at.
And I think George Young in particular, his comment that he said, I'm planting these trees because I want to be a good ancestor. And I thought that was a very interesting...
Yeah, shows the long-term nature of these kinds of things. If you're just chasing next year's wheat price, then your approach to the land, your approach to the community is going to be very different to if you're thinking of being a good ancestor.
Amazing. Thank you very much for the recommendations. Finally, it's quite difficult and it's disconcerting to hear everything that's going on in the world. And I just wondered if you could give a message of hope to anybody listening to this.
Well, so I think... the news, everything in the news is very gloomy, and that belies the fact that, out there in rural areas and also in cities, people are doing innovative, community-based, progressive, environmentally supportive things. And I think that needs to be recognised and understood and talked about. And I think one of the things that we want to do is not only to try and do those things, but also to encourage people to come and visit, to enjoy, to see, to learn, to share, to celebrate those things. So for us, a very big component of what we're doing is not just the doing of it, but the talking about it and getting people to come and stay here, study here, eat here, relax here, whatever it might be, to draw those things together. Because I think people's city-based lives have taken them away from all of those pleasures. They get their food from a supermarket. They've got no connection with where it's grown. They don't appreciate the seasons. They don't enjoy the sunshine in the same way, I think. And so I think we need to reconnect those things.
But I think there are also very interesting projects going on in cities. So I think my message is there are other people doing other things. Get involved. We love it when people turn up and get involved, particularly with the horticulture scheme. It's great to be able to invite people here. There are other things going on. Get involved.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Before we sign off, could you just let us know where we could find you online?
So our website, which is probably the best place, is www.wakelyns.co.uk. We also have Instagram, which is @Wakelyns, and Twitter, which is @Wakelyns. We're reasonably good at keeping those up to date. Certainly through our website, there's a page there where you can put your contact details, and that will put you on our contact mailing list. And then we periodically send out newsletters, and that's where we let people know about general news of Wakelyns, but also events and courses and open days and opportunities at Wakelyns. So that's the way to do it, is to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Mitch Grows Show. I hope you found it as informative and inspirational as I did. I can't wait to go back and visit Wakelyns Farm in the summertime when it's looking lush and abundant. Please guys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments, what you did like and what you didn't like. Also, if there's any guests that you'd like me to go and speak to, then I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, that's it from me guys. Peace and love.